Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello and Yali Madat. My name is Dr. Shemine Gulamhusein, and I have the privilege to serve as a moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversations series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are formal statements that recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as original stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We do this to express gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on and to honor the Indigenous people who have been living with and caring for their lands from time immemorial. Recognizing Indigenous people also means acknowledging the historical and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the ways in which we benefit from and perpetuate violence towards Indigenous peoples. Naming the original and current stewards of the land we live on is a first step towards making reparations. I acknowledge that I am an uninvited occupier on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen, Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. In colonial language, this land is known as Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. We believe the work we do in sessions like these is part of our responsibility to acknowledge and address the ongoing harm to Indigenous peoples. It is part of our work towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, our session on Mother's Day, Happy Mother's Day, honors our foremothers in the Jamaat. Professor Shenila Khoja-Moolji will introduce us to her book, Rebuilding Community, Displaced Women and the Making of Shia Ismaili Societally. Professor Khoja-Moolji is Ahmad bin Khalifa Al Thani, Associate Professor of Muslim Societies at Georgetown University. She researches and writes about the interplay of gender, race, religion, and power, and explores this theme particularly in relation to Muslim populations in South Asia and in the North American diaspora. Professor Khoja-Moolji is an Al-Waiza in the Jamaat, a member of the National ITREB of the United States, and in the past has served as Kamar Saiba of Manhattan Jamatkana and as a member for communications and publications on Northeast Ismaili Council. She is the author of award-winning books, which include Forging the Ideal Educated Girl, The Production of Desirable Subjects in Muslim South Asia, and Sovereign Attachments, Masculinity, Muslimness, and Effective Politics in Pakistan. Her latest book, Rebuilding Community, Displaced Women, and the Making of Shia Ismaili Muslim Society, will be published by Oxford University Press this summer. The book tells the story of how Ismaili Muslim women who fled East Pakistan and East Africa in the 1970s recreated religious community, Jamaat, in North America. But as you will see shortly, she uses the experiences of the cohort to theorize an Ismaili ethics of care. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box where you can share additional questions and thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we possibly can. And one last note before we get started, that the views of the speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. And so let's turn to our wonderful conversation ahead. Thank you to all of the audience. Thank you, Shenila, for joining us today. It's an honor to be able to be here and have this conversation with you. To get us going, having read your book and knowing a little bit of it, I want to first start with, I'm curious about what prompted you to write this book. Why Ismaili women and why at this time?
Thank you so much, Shemine. Yali Madad, everyone. I want to begin by first saying that it is a joy for me to be in conversation with Shemine. And as you were talking, I was just thinking that we could simply switch roles and I could ask you about your work with youth and particularly the community arts-based methodologies that you have used to think about refugee belonging. And so I think after this event is over, I'm going to recommend that we do another CC and flip the roles, inshallah. I also want to take a moment to thank Farhana Husseini for this invitation. She is here, but her video is off. Farhana, as you know, has conceptualized critical conversations. She has put in the labor of constructing and implementing these sessions along with Farhana Sayani. And today is the 65th session. This platform has encouraged conversations that we, quite frankly, were not previously having. And it's created this opening for us, even beyond this platform, to have these conversations within other Jamaati spaces as well. I also think that the broader impact of critical conversations has been to allow us and to open the space for us to sit with complexity, to strive for a rigorous form of thinking. And so from that perspective, I think Farhana's work really extends beyond this platform. And on this Mother's Day, I want to recognize her for putting in all this labor for the educational and cultural reproduction of the American Jamaat. So we thank you, Farhana, and I think this has been an amazing sort of seva that you've done, which hopefully you'll again see is in line with all of these four mothers that we will be speaking about. And so it's my privilege to be here. So Shemine, coming to your question about the motivation, I have photos, and so I'll be sharing my slides while I speak about this work too. So this book actually is personal because it was inspired by my grandmother. In 1971, Nani, along with my mother, who was 12 years old at the time, had to flee East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, due to a civil war. Nani was already a widow at the time. She was caring for 5 young children and her deceased husband's father and sister while working at a restaurant. The war, as you can expect, jolted this family, which was always already on the cusp of poverty. But this was not the first time that Nani's family had been displaced. She was actually born in Gujarat in the 1930s. And given the famines and epidemics in the region, we all know from communal memory that Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah had advised Ismailis to move inward into India or to East Africa because there was increasing activity on the Indian Ocean. And so there were more opportunities that were becoming available in East Africa. So at the time, my Nani and her family moved to Mumbai. But as you know, Mumbai is an urban center. It was really hard for her family to make a living wage there. And so they headed to Calcutta. In Calcutta, however, there were riots during the partition of India in 1940s and 50s, and so they had to move again. And this time they headed to East Pakistan, from where they had to flee in 1971 due to political turmoil. But when Nani's family arrived in Karachi, the Jamaat formed a web of care around them. They were first taken to this refugee sort of camp that was established in the Garden East Jamatkana. That's the image that you see here. And they were given food and clothing. And my mom tells me hot meals, 3 hot meals. So my mom is, mashallah, 64 years at this point, and she was 12 at that time. But that warmth and memory of those hot meals that the Jamaat furnished to this displaced family, it has remained with her. That memory, the sensory memory, has remained with her. An ad hoc committee of volunteers had come together, and these were displaced people themselves who were actually helping other displaced families. And so they helped my Nani find housing. The image that you see here is of the building where my Nani was given a studio, and the rent was subsidized by the Ismaili Jamaat. I took this photo in 2019 when I was visiting the apartment's current residents, who are now refugees from Afghanistan this time, and they're also being supported by the Jamaat. The same committee enrolled my Nani in an Ismaili-run boarding school, and they provided tuition fees for her for several months. In this photo, you see my mom in the white hairband, and she and all these other girls were asked to stay back and learn the Urdu language. So in East Pakistan, they knew how to speak Urdu, but they didn't know the script. And so they're all here, and the teacher has stayed back over summer to teach them this language. And in the meantime, another Ismaili woman helped my nanny find work as a housekeeper at another Ismaili woman's home. So even though this is my story, I know this is also the story of many Khoja Ismailis from this part of the world. But the lives of displaced working class women like my nanny, a widow with 5 children engaged in the informal economy, their lives are often not included in national or even religious histories. And also excluded from our memory is the labor of everyday women who supported these displaced Jamati members. And one of the reasons for this is that our endeavor of writing history has focused on correcting polemics that have circulated about us. So the historian Marshall Hodgson, for example, says that the world usually has heard about Ismailis from their enemies. And so our effort of writing history has unsurprisingly focused on the imams, the Dawa institutions, and the lives of the Da'is themselves, as well as the development of Ismaili doctrines. And there has been good reason for that. But I was concerned about the loss of women's histories and their community-making effort, and that's what motivated me to write this book. I think that by looking at women's history, we're able to expand our understanding of Ismaili religious and social life worlds. We are able to give ourselves an expansive sense of history, because I think it's important to remember that wars, displacement, forced migration, all of this movement that you see in my nanny's life, which are actually representative of the movement of the Khoja Jamaat, they truncate a sense of history because you're never in one place enough to form a robust relationship with that place. And so you're moving, and I think this work of community making that I document in the book also resists that sort of truncation of history and lets us know about this sort of long cultural history and cultural memory that we have. And so in the book, I had the privilege of interviewing 95 Ismaili women and men, 75 women and 20 men. They fled East Pakistan or East Africa in the 1970s. So they're fleeing East Pakistan because of the civil war. And in East Africa, as we know, Idi Amin had expelled Asians, and there was anti-Asian sentiment across other countries too. So Ismailis are fleeing East Africa as well. And from these two countries, they're either going to West Pakistan, the UK, the United States, to Canada in particular. And so I interviewed them. And in my research, I begin with the proposition that community is not a given. We often talk about community as a noun, as if it's already an accomplished sort of entity, but it's really not. So in my book, I'm asking, what are the concrete practices through which women in particular reconstructed Jamaat, reconstructed community across generations and across these continents, right, as they're moving around? So I asked my interlocutors about their lives, their early years of resettlement in North America, but I also asked them about the memories that they have of their parents and grandparents, because as I remind you, this is also a generation that was migrating. And so we don't know much about women of that generation either. In the book, I make at least 2 key interventions. The first is in relation to how we study refugee placemaking. So studies about refugees, they often tend to focus on the contractual relationship between refugees and states, or when we are considering refugee placemaking, we learn about how refugees transform their built environments, particularly public spaces, so that it reflects their needs and aspirations. And so viewed from this lens, diasporic Ismailis, they have constructed their place along migratory routes. We have been establishing Jamatkanas, we have been establishing welfare institutions. But I extend the concept of placemaking beyond the construction of physical infrastructure to include the ordinary acts of care that sustain connection among people and to ideas. Ideas such as, what does it mean to be an Ismaili? What does it mean to be part of a Jamaat? So it's through everyday actions like cooking for a lost traveler, telling a Mojiza story, passing on heritage food recipes, helping a young widow set up a dukkha after her husband passes away. All of these are everyday minor practices through which Ismaili women have stitched together the community through which they try to operationalize the farmans that they hear of their imam about unity and care. And these are also practices through which they give themselves and each other a long cultural memory. The second offering I make in the book is in relation to how we can look at women's practices and understand lived Ismaili faith. So since my interlocutors trace their ancestors to the Sindh-Gujarat corridor, they share a language, they share ethnicity, and therefore it's easy for us to default to ethnicity as the primary lens of analysis, right? And so people can say, oh, you all help each other because you're from the same cultural group. But I wanted to track the role of religion and how religion plays a role in women's relationships to each other, because I wanted to argue that if we pay attention to the Ismaili deen, we will be able to see how Ismailis strive to transcend ethnicity as well. So they strive to care for those who may be ethnically, racially, or even in terms of class different, because they are nonetheless Ismaili. So the kinship that I'm tracking in this book is not a biological kinship. It's a kinship that's based on a shared religious practice, a shared orientation to an Ismaili imam. And so placemaking after displacement then becomes a scenario of sorts for me to theorize what an everyday Ismaili ethics of care looks like.
Wow, that's, you offer all of these insights into this idea of ethics of care. And I guess my question is, if a Jamaati member was to pick up your book, can you just share perhaps the structure of the book and how they might see all of those points that you just discussed play out?
Oh, thank you, Shemine, for that question. I have so many photos, and so I'm going to share my slides again and show you the photos. So I'll take you through some of the stories by way of actually sharing what you will find in the book in terms of the chapters. So this chapter, the second chapter, is the chapter where I'm tracing the memories of my primary interlocutors in terms of their mothers and foremothers. I wanted to understand their sort of lives in East Pakistan and East Africa, because the older story of this migration of Ismailis is often, as we know, told from the perspective of men who thrived in the colonial political economy. I wanted to instead see how are women reinforcing spiritual affinities in context where they too are migrants, right? And so they're early migrants, but in the case of East Africa, they've been there for at least, some of my interlocutors were there for like 3 generations. And so we see a sort of a longer arc of their lives too. So in this chapter, we meet Miti Bai Premji of Mombasa and Taj Bibi Abu Ali Aziz of Dar es Salaam, who took in boarders from smaller towns so they could attend school. I placed their work in the broader context of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah's farmans about women's education from the turn of the 20th century. We know that the Imam was advising and advocating for girls' education, and structurally, he also tried to kind of establish girls' schools so that Ismailis could send their sort of daughters into these schools. But here we see how ordinary women too are creating an environment to help advance girls' education. So we see this dynamic relationship between Imam and ordinary women, and how these women are actually supplementing the Imam's work. I should also note here that while we know about the work of elite Ismaili men, we really don't know much about women from this time period. As an example, almost everyone I met from Mombasa, they knew about Ada's boarding house, they knew even Ada's name, but no one knew Miti Bai's name. And I found out her name from a colonial document. And so likewise, many of us know who Abu Ali missionary is, but do we know who Taj Bibi is? That's his wife. And she was the one who was taking care of all of these girls that you see in this photograph. These are girls who would stay in her house because they were there to become the first wa'izins in the center that Abu Ali missionary was running. And so we really don't know much about the women who are also actively supporting the Jamaat at this time. And so in part, this chapter is also trying to bring visibility to that sort of generation of women so that they enter our collective memory. So everyone who's here in the audience now will remember Taj Bibi after this presentation, inshallah. At the same time, as I mentioned, I wanted to look at women's daily practices to uncover how faith is practiced through minor gestures and everyday decisions. And so we learn about how Sherbanu Lalani auntie, she kept one double for dasont and one double for household expenditures so that dasont money doesn't get mixed up for money available to buy soap. We learn about how an older Ismaili woman helped Zareen Taj Sultan get admission into a nursing program, a degree that eventually helped her to get visa and migrate to the United States when she had to flee East Pakistan. And so this photo that I took of her, she's showing me that particular degree because this has such a salient importance for her. And the kindness of that Ismaili lady has kind of traveled with her throughout these generations because she was able to become a nurse. But I also wanted to give density to faith. I wanted to also show that practicing a sort of Ismaili moral code requires effort and exertion. So returning to Zareen Taj auntie's example, we learned that although her parents were, they advocated her education, she was already going to an excellent school, but they did not really want her to go into higher ed. So they declined from sending her to nursing school. But then one Chandrat, a talika, comes from the Imam, in which he is encouraging nursing schools. And so I'll remind us that in the 1960s, 70s, right, he's talking about nursing broadly. And so this little 15-year-old girl marches up to her dad in Jamatkana, and the dad is an amaldari, so I think he's sitting in the front. And so Zareen Taj auntie tells me that she marches up to him, and then she goes, see, even Mola wants me to do nursing. And the father agrees. And so I tell this story and many other stories in the book to show that often we will see hesitation at the beginning, people striving to understand and make sense of farmans that don't seem to jive with their cultural practices. So I then move on to share accounts of fleeing as Ismaili women fled East Pakistan and East Africa in the 1970s, early 1970s. Now, one could really write an entire book about this because everyone I spoke to had stories of hardship and trauma that they shared. But I wanted to include at least some examples so that when my readers read all the community-making effort that they will see in the remaining book, that they're able to see that that effort of community building flows besides all the trauma and the hardship that these women had experienced or were experiencing in the early years of resettlement, right? So we're able to appreciate some of the work that they're doing if we are also mindful of the very recent trauma of displacement and war, and also the hardship that they're experiencing. So for example, women tell me of seeing killings. And so one woman saw a man killed from her balcony and then again at the airport. Another one tells me about dressing up as a bride and hiding in a car so that if they're caught, she was going to say that she was an army officer's bride. And so maybe the army officers would let her go. Others tell me about being thrown things at on the streets of Toronto, being called Paki on the streets. Men remember getting beaten up, being kidnapped, experiencing long periods of unemployment once they came to North America. Families tell me of living on ketchup packets for days on end earlier on. And so, as I said, I think once we read these stories, we have a sense of a new appreciation for the help that they extended to co-religionists when they themselves were really struggling at the time. And so in this image, you see Omida Switlow with the bag that she carried when she left Uganda alone as a teenager. In chapter 3, I examine women's efforts to create and sustain Jamatkanas across generations. I introduce Gulzar Qasim and Roshan Pirani, who created makeshift Jamatkanas at their apartments in Atlanta and Fort Wayne. And in this photo, this is an amazing find for me because you can see the chadar that is being laid down on the floor. In this Jamatkana, they used curtains for partitions. They trimmed the legs of a coffee table to make it resemble a pot. They burned agarbatti and they shared food. And this is how they started creating these makeshift Jamatkanas. And in the book, I talk about 2 such Jamatkanas, but In my primary research of Ismaili magazines published from 1970s and 80s, I note that there are multiple congregations that are emerging in North America in particular. And so I'm hoping that by reading at least this sort of scenario of two Jamatkanas, that other Ismailis would also try to document some of those other gatherings that were simultaneously taking place. I did a Jamatkana talk last night in DC, and I met Shireen Auntie, who was actually establishing a makeshift Jamatkana in 1967 in her apartment in LA. And so there are so many stories in our Jamaat. And so I'm hoping that at least this chapter prompts us to uncover those stories too. But broadly in this chapter, I also wanted to note that Ismailis conjured a sensorium of Jamatkana even during flight. On the Shams steamer, for example, my interlocutors tell me that women would recite ginans to soothe themselves. One of them mentioned it felt just like a Jamatkana. Another interlocutor, Roshan Pirani, she talks about how Kamaluddin missionary and his wife were on board, and they held the Ginan and Wise classes that they had offered in Chittagong Jamatkana on the steamer too. And that provided a strange, I mean, you can imagine a strange sense of continuity on board at a time when this predominantly Ismaili, predominantly female, I mean, these were all women and children mostly at this time. It is a precarious time because all of the men had stayed behind to either sell their businesses or their houses, or there weren't enough seats or tickets for the men to come in this particular steamer. And so these recitations and these ginans helped them recall the sensorium of Jamatkana. And so I use these examples to theorize that a sensorium of Jamatkana can be conjured, shared, and transmitted by and through a collective of Ismaili practitioners. In chapter 4, I discuss community making through Mojiza stories. I include stories of miraculous rescues of Ismailis who were trapped in Jamatkanas, as well as unexpected aid from strangers that Ismailis received during early years of resettlement, and how they interpret these rescues and these aids as God and Imam's protective care, that Imam is coming to help them. And so their retelling is simultaneously a way for Ismailis who went through a traumatic past to make sense of that past, but it was also an ethical transaction with me, the listener, to participate in my religious formation. And of course, I speak about that one-on-one transmission of or an ethical transaction. But if you think in the community, these Dakhla stories or these miracle stories circulate, and both Ismaili men and women participate in the religious formation of the next generation through these Mojiza stories. In chapter 5, I consider food and cooking practices of women. Of course, we all know that women have sustained our Jamaats by cooking for Sagri Dams and Kushalis, and that, of course, is a familiar story. And so on this slide, we see Shakar Kanu Auntie. She used to cook for Jamaats in Dar es Salaam. And in this photo, you see her cooking with an Ismaili cooking group that was established in Toronto. And this was their first sort of Kushali that they were celebrating. Her son-in-law even showed me the recipe book that she used in Dar that she also used in Toronto. And so in this particular example, we see how women forged a very sort of tangible connection across oceans. But I extend this investigation and look in particular at cookbooks that were written by Ismaili women. So even though cookbooks are some of the earliest texts that Ismaili women in the diaspora wrote, they remain an understudied archive. And so I look at them to understand how women pass on heritage recipes, but also how through certain foods, they tell stories about Ismaili history. So there is a Ismaili diasporic history that is embedded in the foods. So consider kukupaka, which is a famous Ismaili East African dish. I look at kukupaka to understand how Ismaili women melded Indian spices with the locally plentiful coconut. And in every cookbook that I studied, we find recipes of siro. And so women are also teaching readers about ritual foods and how to make them in the diaspora. In fact, women's food practices can also give us a glimpse into how the act of cooking can be a spiritual practice. So my nani often used to say that I don't use lal mirchi in my food because Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah advised against it. And so my mom imbibed that lesson, and she doesn't use lal mirchi either. So food becomes a reminder of Ismaili past. It's a sensory inheritance, and it's also a site for passing on nutritional advice of the Imam. During my interviews, multiple Ismaili women, multiple aunties would send me documents upon documents that actually archive Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah's advice on nutrition. And they would cite how their selections and prohibitions of food are actually inspired by his guidance. Finally, in chapter 6, I explore community making in the second generation, the daughters of my primary interlocutors. And this is the chapter that includes both Shemine and Farhana's story as well. So this generation is born in North America, or they arrived here at a very young age. They have no memories of war or displacement. Unlike their parents who had established Jamatkanas, many women that I interviewed grew up in the 80s and 90s in context where Jamatkanas and councils were already established in some form, right? So they were in rented places, sometimes also in purpose-built Jamatkanas. While their parents experienced deterritorialization due to wars and poverty, everything that I've been tracking thus far, this generation experiences deterritorialization due to a neoliberal economy that requires workers to be mobile. And so these women are moving for jobs. They live far from Jamatkana and other community members. Both Shemine and I, for example, have that experience of living really far from Jamatkana and moving from place to place because of jobs. And so their lives are also shaped by experience of being racialized and religious minorities in North America. Also, the Jamaat that they are encountering is much more heterogeneous. So in contrast to the homogeneous Khoja Jamaat of 50 years ago of my primary interlocutors, right? So we now have Ismailis from Central Asia and Middle East in the US. And so we're meeting Ismailis of other intellectual traditions in Jamatkanas as well. And so in this chapter, I inquire into their efforts, second generation's effort, to participate in and sustain the Ismaili sociality. This close study shows the unique challenges of this generation, but also how their community-making practices are taking on new forms as a result. So in addition to Jamatkanas, which anthropologist Zara Jamaat has described as a microcosm for volunteering, this second generation forms new connections through social media and digital programming, like critical conversations. They are writing new curriculum, like the Aleph curriculum, for younger Ismailis who are born in the United States. They do substantial intellectual work in dissertations. They express their understandings and their life experiences through artwork, like the artwork that you see right here by Romana. And so it is one of the artworks in which she's thinking about what it means for her to be Ismaili in an American context. This generation also rejects the model minority paradigm and instead seeks to forge alliances with other minorities in America. So they take their ethics to the streets when they march alongside Black Lives Matter activists. And this alliance making is also a direct result of their struggle with anti-Blackness exhibited by their ancestors in East Africa and anti-Bengali attitudes in East Pakistan. So their present-day activism in America is connected to the reflections that they are having on the recent Ismaili past. And so one thing then that I do in this book is to participate in that conversation by putting some interpretations around the questions that this generation has. So for example, I situate the anti-Blackness of Ismaili ancestors in the broader context of British racial colonialism in East Africa that relied on divisions between and among colonized people. So the British, for example, executed these divisions through policies, through laws that segregated Black and brown people. They couldn't go to same schools, they couldn't live in the same neighborhoods, they could not be in the same trade. And so conflict among the colonized was not incidental, but actually a critical component of racial capitalism and colonialism in East Africa, because it ensured that the colonized will see each other as competition and they won't forge an alliance against the British then, right? And so it's a crucial part of that British racial capitalism, and anti-Blackness accompanies that. It is also part of that ideological device. And so the book doesn't shy away from these questions because I think it's important for us to situate our ancestors in their own historical context so that we can understand their choices, their lives, and their constraints, but also how they try to transcend some of these constraints as well. So in the book, I also provide evidence of Black and Brown affinities, as well as moments when Ismailis participated in anti-colonial struggles. So we have evidence of Ismailis who participated in anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa. And then in the concluding chapter, I try to bring all of this together.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts and reflections. And I think the first thing, before I move on to the next question, you've embedded this idea of ethics of care in each of the stories, and you've pulled this out. And as I hear you talk and as I read the book, all I could think about was how in different contexts we're naming these things differently, thinking about wellness, thinking about mental health, and some of the examples you provided, right? Reciting Ginan and providing these classes on these ships, how perhaps that's self-soothing and self-care during these journeys of what we name trauma or hardship, and yet how there's so much light even in the moments of trauma and hardship, and it really sits deep. And I think in the review of your book by Dr. Zain Qasim, who shared that, and I'll quote Dr. Qasim, "Careful research destabilizes understandings of migratory and refugee populations as solely victimized and traumatized, pointing instead to how the placemaking practices of such women draw upon shared spiritualities, ritual practices, traumatizing dislocations, and cultural traditions to forge connections across generations and geographical locations," end quote. And you talk about this idea of makeshift Jamatkanas and these movements and these ethics of care. And I'm wondering if you can offer us, the audience, if you can give us a sense of any unexpected examples of placemaking that you might have encountered.
Thank you, Shemine. So since I was an insider of sorts, I had a sort of intuitive understanding of some of the placemaking practices that we see in the Jamaat. But what was most interesting for me was this connection with other Ismailis that I was able to establish during the course of the interviews. And so the interviews transformed into an occasion that was placemaking for me too, right? I was able to feel embedded within the sort of Ismaili sociality that I was writing about. And if you permit me, I will read just 2 pages from my Mojiza chapter, because that's where I provide an ethnographic vignette of one of these interviews, and you will see how the occasion is also in placing for me and what the interviewer is doing as well. Okay, so let me just pull it up. I met 88-year-old Shamsuddin in his first floor apartment in Karimabad, Karachi. He looked frail in his wheelchair and did not at first feel able to talk with me. But his caretaker insisted that I just sit in the corner and wait. He will open up eventually. And so I did. After some initial inquiries, which helped Shamsuddin establish that I was in fact related to his sister, he seemed more open and warmed to the conversation. Shamsuddin spoke in short sentences, primarily in Urdu and Gujarati. I was all set to work through the oral history protocol I usually followed, asking questions about childhood and seeking information about the Ismaili community and then experiences of fleeing from East Pakistan. However, as soon as I mentioned my interest in his life in Memansingh, Shamsuddin went straight to the trauma of 1971. It was a massacre, he said, and he began to weep. I was caught off guard by the sudden shift in mood, but followed his lead. In late 1971, as tensions between East and West Pakistani forces intensified, Shamsuddin decided it was time to flee. But he wanted first to sell his meager belongings so he would have some money to start over in Karachi. However, riots broke out in his neighborhood and he found himself trapped along with a few dozen other Ismailis. They decided it would be safer if they moved into the Jamatkana rather than remain isolated in their homes. They camped in the Jamatkana for 29 days, eating, sleeping, and praying together. They were so certain of their impending death that the Mukhi performed final rites for each person. None of us could speak during the ritual ceremony. The Mukhi was weeping and we were weeping. As one of the few men left behind, Shamsuddin was tasked with safety and security. He was to stand by the gates of the Jamatkana and keep the rioters out. One day, some locals arrived at the entrance to warn him, "You are next." Shamsuddin remembers the Jamaat sheltering in fear that night, but nothing happened. The next morning, the men returned to report that they had in fact been prevented from attacking. "Your imam was holding a danda and guarding the gates of the Jamatkana," they said. "Your imam was riding a white horse and circling the Jamatkana." As Shamsuddin shared this episode, tears trickled down his deeply wrinkled cheeks. Then suddenly I saw his chest swell up like that of a young man's. He sat up straight in his battered wheelchair. In a loud voice that belied his frail frame, he announced the presence of the imam. "You see, he is standing in our midst. He is standing in our midst. He is standing in our midst." Shamsuddin repeated the refrain aloud as if it were a declaration to people passing on the streets outside his building. As if decades later, he was finally revealing the secret details of an intimate meeting with his beloved. They ran away. Not a child was hurt. We all passed with ease. We went in the Shams steamer. It was the last steamer to leave Chittagong. I sensed that Shamsuddin wanted to say more, but twice he pushed away his wheelchair from me. "I have said too much already," he said, hinting again that this was a story he felt he needed to safeguard. For 10 minutes, we sat in silence as I ate the biscuits and slowly sipped the chai Shamsuddin's caretaker had brought me. Suddenly, Shamsuddin lifted up his tasbih and said, "Tasbih does not lie. He takes care of us like a mother takes care of her small child. This is the mu'jiza of my life." Shamsuddin pushed back his wheelchair one final time, wiping away his tears with a ragged, stained handkerchief. I knew that the interview was over. Brushing away my own tears, I agreed. Yes, this is the mu'jiza. The term mu'jiza derives from a root meaning that which overwhelms or that which disables. In Muslim theological discourses, mu'jiza points to those occasions when God and saintly figures overpower. These stories gesture towards a larger order when the imam ruptures the zahir to save his murids. Shamsuddin thus affirms key Shia Ismaili beliefs related to imama, namely the imam's divinely designated appointment, his divinely inspired ilm of both the apparent and hidden dimensions of reality, and his God-given sanctity, valaya, which includes the belief that imam can intercede with God. Shamsuddin accordingly believes that the imam can alter the situation of his followers in the material world through intercession with God. By storing his experience, Shamsuddin simultaneously seeks to make sense of a traumatic moment in his own life and recruit me, the listener, as a believer. When he shouts that tasbih does not lie, he gives me a lesson in daily spiritual life, that prayers are not left unanswered and the imam will always protect his followers. I'm going to stop here.
Oh my gosh. I think, so much comes from what you just read. And one of the things I think the audience will now have a sense of your writing and how accessible and how Jamaat oriented it is. It's, it's language that we as young Jamaati members can understand and maybe make meaning of in our own ways. And it kind of leads me to my last maybe question is, I have many, but I think about these reflections that you've offered and these stories of our histories, and some of us, including myself, have not heard many of these stories. We hear about the hardships and we hear about these moments of migration, but we don't hear the depth of it, and we don't experience it. And as you share in your book and today in this session, you share these stories with the ethic of care embedded in it. And I'm wondering, could you share maybe a vision that you might have for how young people in the Jamaat should take this book up?
Thank you, Shemine. So I have thus far, I've taught parts of this book to my students at Georgetown. And so I have a little bit of a sample of how people are engaging with the book too. So I think of this text as a prompt. I have seen that younger folks like my students are in college. So the way they are engaging with it is that they have read the book and they then have conversations with their parents, and they figure out things about their parents that they didn't actually know before. And so in that manner, the book acts as a prompt for additional conversations, additional modes of recovery, additional sort of ways in which we can actually think about and learn about our parents and immediate Ismaili history. The second hope I have is around the sort of interpretive work that I'm doing, right? I think one of the key impetus for me to write this book was, of course, to make women visible, to archive their history. But I also wanted to use this specific cohort to think about what does it mean for us to be Ismaili? And I wanted to offer a sort of, this is a transgenerational book, right? And so we start with women early in the 20th century. My interlocutors are in the 1970s, and then there's a second generation. And I want to offer some interpretive lens to see how this sociality is mobile, it is moving, its understandings of what it means to be Ismaili, and its understandings of how that Ismaili-ness works out in everyday sort of contingencies of life is also moving. And so I think we have shared orientations to the Imam, and we share orientations to each other, but we can actually think about how being an Ismaili is a project that is a moving project, and it's going to look different. And I think if we do that, then we're going to keep the future Ismaili society pretty agile. We'll continue to make space for different ways of being Ismailis, different sites for Ismaili formation and Ismaili sociality. And I think that sort of future vision was really important to me too. So while I want people to have a conversation about this past, the conversation about the past is so that we have capacious, expansive futures, right? And so I'm also hoping that the interpretive work that I'm doing in the book also provides a vision to not only youth, but also across like Jamaati leadership, right? To think about like, how do we actually proceed from here? And so I think that sort of bridge across generations was also, and that's my hope too. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your very reflective thoughts. I'm left sitting here thinking about so many things, in particular about that concept that you just talked about as a prompt to understand my own history, to go back to my parents and their siblings, and to learn about their journeys and various things. And you kind of mentioned it earlier, and then also how do I integrate it into this idea of there was hardship, there was faith, there was all these things, but how does play and recreation play out?
Yeah.
And how did that keep people going? And I think that you've offered us as a Jamaat such a beautiful prompt to say, being Ismaili is not, there are particular practices and engagements, but Ismailism crosses so many sectors of our everyday life. And how do we take it up? And how does that also shift and navigate in different spaces and contexts, and even us as Ismailis moving across. So, but I mean, you and I can have conversations for many, many hours. But with everything that's been spoken about, we have received a few questions from the audience, so I'll turn it to them. But which I'll share with you, and we'd love some of your insight. So the first one that we got was, what wonderful stories and learnings. I wonder how we as a collective community might document biographies of these and other women in a publicly accessible online archive so that future generations may have access to their stories and learnings as well.
That's an excellent question. And I know that there is a new project in the Ismaili special collections at the IAS. I think it's called Oral Histories Project. And I think that's precisely what they're doing. I know that in part they are archiving. So if you just Google Ismaili Special Collections IAS, I think you will see a website in which much of this sort of archival material is being featured. And I think they've started doing recordings of oral histories too. So I'm hoping that in the near future, those might be accessible too. But I will encourage folks who are interested in this type of work to perhaps reach out and offer your labor, because I think, of course, I can't speak for institutions and I can't speak for the IAS, but I would imagine that, right now, maybe it's one or two people who are doing this work. And if there are resources, particularly labor for archiving, cataloging that Jamaat can offer, that would be really nice to speed up the work, because they have an enormous archive from my understanding. And so to make it publicly available, that's the sort of digital sort of labor that we can offer.
Yeah, and your book is another example. It holds many of these stories. So the second question we had that came in was, as a community identity moves further away from that of a forcibly displaced community to a more settled one with more tenuous linkages to one another, are there experiences from other communities that might inform how the role responsibilities of each gender may evolve?
So I think I wouldn't be able to talk about other communities because I haven't done a sort of deep dive in other groups. But I will say that, as I mentioned, I begin with the proposition that relationality or a community is not a given. And so even though in the second generation chapter where Shemine and Farhana are featured, I speak about all these new spaces for sociality that are being created, I still note how the Jamatkana remains a very salient site for all of the people that I interviewed. And so even, so when people move to these new cities, I interviewed a couple of people, they were like, the first thing we try to figure out where Jamatkana is. That doesn't mean that they're going to Jamatkana every day. This is just a tangible Ismaili sociality, a place, a representational place that they know that's there, so they can turn to when they need to. And so I think as we're thinking about the future, maybe thinking about how we need to create additional sites for relationality, while also ensuring that some of these places where a face-to-face intimate contact can take place are also nurtured, that we're investing our labor in building those spaces of intimate contact as well. And so I think that's how I see this sort of space evolving, particularly as I was offering some thoughts in the second gen chapter.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And the third question that we will respond to today is, thank you for providing great examples of religion, Furman's overriding ethnicity, as well as culture, gender norms to move the Jamaat forward. How can we continue acts of care for the different divisions between generations and views on social issues?
So I think one of the things that you will see in the book is around how I offer making community as a task that's also difficult, and it's very intentional. So I cite examples of moments where Ismailis were not held by their Jamaats. Two of my interlocutors from East Pakistan tell me about being bullied in Jamatkana. One of them tells me that people would say that, oh, because of them, our juror runs out. Another one recalls that her braid was like, people would pull on her braid One woman actually had a very difficult experience with a man who she thought was actually going to give her a job. And so I think I talk about these examples to show that community building relationality is not a given. The risk of fragmentation, the risk of people falling out through the cracks always exists, and it flows besides these sort of moments of relationality that we're building. And so I think first and foremost, it's so crucially important to be very aware of the differences in our Jamaat, right? We have to be aware of racial differences, ethnic differences, class differences, sexuality differences. I think if we are not having conversation about these differences, then there is quite frankly no way that we're going to transcend them, right? So if we're invisible, oh, this thing doesn't exist, then of course, you're not even going to be able to see the oppression that unfolds through it, right? And so I think having a conversation about differences, it's not at all, it shouldn't be taken as divisive or as disturbing the harmony of the Jamaat, but it should be actually taken as a step toward building a harmonious Jamaat. And so I think once we have an understanding of these risks, then we build our structures, and then we build sort of these situations that we can mend them. And I think in that mending, I hope that some of this interpersonal sort of relationships that I have explained in the book will make a difference. But there's this another level of relationship, the institutional work, the structures that reframe our organizational culture, for example, that work also is ongoing. And so, of course, because I'm looking at deep communities, I've not talked about those institutions, and other people have done that sort of work. And so I think that interpersonal and structural change have to go hand in hand to continue this sort of community building.
You know, and you talk about this interpersonal and personal, or institutional and interpersonal, and I think it leads us into, there was another question that came up as you were chatting. We have a few minutes, so I'll just offer it. Mm-hmm. So during your presentation, you flagged that unfortunately there is new displacement occurring as we speak in the Afghan, Tajik, Syrian communities. Are there lessons we can take away from our earlier experiences on how we might make the experiences of these communities easier?
That's such an excellent question, and I'll be quite frank. I started doing some work with Afghan refugees, but then I was really focusing on this book, so I haven't extended my research on sort of that group. But I will say, from very limited, I mean, I'm a scholar, so I'm just going to produce caveat that, okay, this is based on like 5 interviews. I think that the place that Afghan Ismailis are coming from is a little bit different, also because the ways in which Jamatkanas were established in East Africa and East Pakistan, they were not really the anchors of community life in Afghanistan in that way. Afghan Ismailis also speak a lot about being minoritized and discriminated in Afghanistan. And of course, I think that it's a different history, it's a different practice of relationality and community that I think deserves its own analysis, because when Afghan Ismailis come here, we can't simply automatically assume that they will have affection for Jamatkana just like the Khojas did. Because if you're not really going to Jamatkana every day in Afghanistan, then why would you go to Jamatkana every day when you're in the US, right? And so I think the histories from that perspective are a little bit different. And so what would be most exciting would be to reorient our thinking and to offer community making, community spaces, not as an experience that these Jamaats already should have, but as places that one can integrate into everyday life. And that integration has to look different for different intellectual sort of traditions of the Jamaat. The Khojas have different engagements, and we should keep space for the other intellectual traditions to have their own engagements. And I think that's hard work. And I think that's hard work, but that's like such important work. And I really, really hope that hopefully the book prompts us to think about some of these questions, particularly in relation to, as you said, there are so many immediately sort of new displaced communities that we are sort of entering in. So there are lessons, but there's also a lesson that this space requires its own analysis because of differences in the cultural history as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shenila. There's some really wonderful comments in the chat. And so for everyone that's put them in, Shenila and I will read them. I also know, Shenila, you've shared so much with us today, and I just want to say thank you, and thank you to the audience for joining us. Without you, there is no critical conversation. So please do continue to write in the chat box as we finish up if there's comments. You'll notice that in the chat box, Farhana is continuously putting links for all of you. Today was especially a treat for me because your book and your work continues to inspire so much of what I hope to do in my own scholarship.
And I'm inspired by you, as you know.
And I just love chatting with you.
Yes.
So this was
and we will
really,
do a
really
flip,
wonderful.
inshallah, very soon.
Inshallah.
Yes.
No, yeah, I would love the opportunity to continue our conversations and including with our audience. Just a couple of announcements before we do close for today. In the chat, you will find resources that are recommended by the speaker, Shenila, her links to her books. You'll also find there are recordings for this conversation as well as past critical conversations. Please visit the Facets of Faith page on the Ismaili USA, and I believe Farhana has put that into the chat box as well. Please look out for more information on the Ismaili USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week and our next critical conversations. They are, as you today hopefully witness, beautiful and inspiring and motivating. And lastly, we do ask that you take a survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen as you leave. And thank you once again for joining us, and Shenila for all of the inspiration and reflection you've offered.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for making time, everyone. Thank you.